This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
I think we live in a world today where people, at the end of the day, and this is also what we learn in sales, all they really care about is, can you help me, right? So when we sit across the table of someone, the first thing we try to do is, what is his or her objectives? What are his or her problems? And how do we help them to address those problems? And I think once we really started to get into those conversations, like the age issue didn't even come up for us.
It isn't possible to draw lines along age, tenure, skill, and leadership in the working world as neatly as previously. The image of top leaders has expanded beyond the notion of someone assuming the position after a long-drawn process. This is a convention upended, perhaps most prominently, by the heady proliferation of influential startups with precociously young leaders at the helm, one of whom we'll speak to today. Hello, I'm Tay Hong Yi. You're listening to Headstart On Record. Get a head start in your personal finance and career with us. Our guest today dropped out of university at the age of 21 to co-found a major homegrown startup before moving on to management consulting and subsequently venture capital. He's Mr. Looi Qin En, who was previously a co-founder of careers discovery platform Glints and is now currently a partner at venture capital firm Saison Capital. Welcome to the show, Qin En.
Thank you for having me.
So, Qin En, let's just get into it. So you started Glints very young, 2013. How did you end up starting Glints with your fellow co-founders that young?
The story of Glints was really one that's an accidental startup story. Actually, I grew up in a typical Singaporean household, actually even more typical in the sense that both my parents were in academia. My mom is a secondary school Chinese teacher, my dad's a university professor. So as you can imagine, grades were everything. And I never ever thought that entrepreneurship would be the path that I would take. But as it turned out, between national service and going to college, going to university, I was looking for internships. And I started to realize, hey, there's actually a lot of people like me, young, no work experience, but we were looking for internships. But we can't really do internships with large companies because large companies usually want year 3, year 4 undergrads. So we very quickly learned that there's also another group of employers that actually wanted whichever interns they could get, which was startups. So really, Glints started as a startup internship matching platform, connecting young people like myself back then to startups for internships. One thing led to another. We managed to raise multiple rounds of investment and were very fortunate to be the first generation of venture-backed founders back in 2013, 2014. And today, Glints is one of the largest career platforms in Asia.
And, when you have a career platform, a digital product that scaled and grew more complex, pivoted, and so on, there are significant technical skills as well as soft skills involved in this sort of endeavor. How did you develop these skills on the sort of compressed time frame from a young age onwards? Because you would have to do that, I would imagine, to inspire the sort of confidence among your teammates and colleagues, even those who are older and with more years of experience, chronologically speaking.
Absolutely. I think a lot of that comes down to really the guidance and support that we got. And really during the Glints days, some of the most influential people were our investors. They really helped us to navigate many of these challenges, from hiring and even firing people, which sometimes is a lot harder, to how do we solve building products, what are the best practices. So I think you're right, the growth journey wasn't easy, it wasn't smooth, but really it's because we had a very strong ecosystem of mentors, of investors that surrounded us, that really helped us to learn. And of course, we also made plenty of mistakes, which we picked ourselves up and managed to recover.
Perhaps then, could I invite you to share about some of these lessons that you have learned, practical lessons, right, from some of these leaders in the fields? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest lesson, which even till this day I remember very viscerally, is actually the importance and how to sell. So here was the story. I dropped out of Stanford to build a company. This was after we had raised our first seed round, our venture capital round. Coming out of Stanford, giving up my government scholarship at a point, of course, it was a difficult decision to make, but also there was some level of ego when you are 20, 21 years old. And I thought at that point, selling is beneath me, right? Selling, maybe I can hire people to go do it for me, right? I'm the boss. I should sit here. I should tell you, hey, go out there and get sales done. That was when one of our investors really whooped us into shape and said, no, you 3 founders, pick up the phone, cold call, and start to sell. And to be honest, I personally really, really resisted it because it was the fear of rejection, the fear of selling. I remember I would pick up my phone trying to call, and I was like, don't pick up. And then if they pick up, I'm like, oh, what do I do? Because I had to sell, right? I had to pitch our recruitment solutions. And that was such a life-changing, I would say, moment and lesson that I took away, because after, it's like a muscle. It's like a muscle that once I built it, once I'm okay with rejection, once I'm okay to do cold calls, after that, it was like there was nothing stopping us. And that was really also what changed the trajectory of the company. We thought that you could build a successful company just by having a cool, good-looking product. But no, that's not a company. That's a product. A company is defined by something that makes revenue, right? That generates sales. And so really the ability for us to sell was one of the biggest lessons that I learned. Not just the skills, not just what to say, not just the tactics, but really, I would say, getting past the ego, getting past the fear of rejection, getting past the fact that I just dropped out of a top school, so I don't need to sell. I think those were actually some of the most transformative moments for me.
Then how did that translate to really inspiring confidence as, Glints scaled? And I guess that also applies now with your current role with Saison. You mentioned that you're still the youngest partner at Saison right now. How do you get people to look past the age and convince them really that you have the chops, you're here to do something?
I think I'm very fortunate, and I know many people who are also in the same situation where age is no longer a barrier, right? I think we live in a world today where people, at the end of the day, and this is also what we learn in sales, all they really care about is, can you help me, right? So when we sit across the table of someone, the first thing we try to do is, what is his or her objectives? What are his or her problems? And how do we help them to address those problems? And I think once we really started to get into those conversations, like the age issue didn't even come up for us, right? Customers would just come to us to say, hey, I need to hire someone with XYZ requirements. And our ability to deliver was what helped build trust. And that trust led to more contracts, more sales, more referrals. And that was really how Glints took off, right? And this is the same thing that we see, that I personally see today, right? At the end of the day, it's about understanding, empathizing the person you're sitting across to, understanding what drives him or her, and speaking in their language. It's no longer about what do I bring to the table, oh, this is how good I am, this is why my product is awesome. It's all about what is your real needs and how do we solve them together.
And I imagine that also applied internally, really, when in the scaling journey with hiring and so on, because I would imagine in this sort of venture, you end up with engineering leaders, various functional leaders older than you with more chronologically just years of experience more.
Absolutely. I think, and that's the only way to scale, right? By being people who are smarter, more experienced, have seen more things than us. We have been and we were and we still are very fortunate to sort of build strong teams around us. And I think it's really because of we're also able to attract people who share the same beliefs as us, that age is really not a barrier. At the end of the day, it's really about what value can you bring to the people around you.
So when we are talking about this, right, that implies some sort of acceleration of that sort of learning process and the experience, right? And on top of that, curating the sort of atmosphere that disfavors people with ego. But have you ever had to really manage egos as such?
Look, I think it's true. Even during the Glints days, when we finally got past doing sales and we started to do sales, multiple times, me and my co-founders would walk into an office and the boss would be like, are you guys university students here to do some survey? And it's like, when you start with that, how do you even recover from it? But, you brush it off, you put your game face on and you just go ahead, right? So look, I think you're right, Hong Yi, in the sense that there are always people who will carry these skepticisms. But at the end of the day, it's, once again, going back to the sales concept, it's a funnel, right? At the top of the funnel, you will have many people, all kinds of people. But at the end of the day, it's about who do you choose to partner with, who do you choose to work with, who do you choose to hire, and you sort of work through this funnel where you sort of filter out people and you ending up with the people who share the same beliefs, share the same philosophies as you.
So what would you say are some of the ways that you can accelerate that learning to that baseline level? Because I know that, it's not as strongly correlated with seniority or age or, just raw years of experience, but you mentioned ecosystem as one thing, but maybe could you share some of the other things that really accelerated that sort of process to get you up to scratch for that position that young?
Absolutely. I think it's applicable regardless of role, even if you're not a founder. And I'm currently not a founder, but I think I still am able to apply a lot of these lessons. I think I break it down simply as, firstly, when you get into your job, are you adopting a founder mode or a employee mode, right? And I think these are pretty crude descriptions, but I'll just explain it. A founder mode is one that takes ownership, right? A one that says, even if this is a problem that is not in my job scope, I will take ownership, I'll figure out how it's done, right? And I would find the right people and solve the problem. The organization's problems are my problems. I care about it. I want to do it, right? Versus sort of the employee mode, which is like, okay, I'm here to collect my paycheck. I'm here to do whatever that's on my job scope. Once I'm done, I'm done. Don't ask me to do anything else. I think, there's no right or wrong, to be clear, but if you want to accelerate your learning, it's pretty obvious what you should go for, right? Which is the founder mode. So I think it's really about the sense of ownership, the sense of responsibility. I think that's one. The second piece, which I think is very important to complement what I just said, it's also the ability to follow up and follow through. Often it's easy to get excited, especially at the start, right? At the beginning. Oh, let's do this, let's do that. We're gonna achieve this, achieve that. But then there's so many of these people that just leave it at talk and don't actually put in the effort to see things through, to actually get things done, right? And I think the ability for someone to follow up, to follow through, sometimes it's just all that matters. You just need to be a bit more thick-skinned, a bit more persistent to really just, not just push yourself, but actually push the people around you, which is sometimes a lot more important, to really follow up and follow through. Once again, it's a tactic in sales. You don't just go for your first sales meeting and expect that check to land on your table. You expect to follow up, answer questions, respond to objections. So many of these sales principles in life that I learned at the startup are also very applicable. So basically, founder mode, own your problems, combined with the ability to follow up and follow through.
So how has that sort of formative experience, at that age, and then now you bring it to that sort of VC space, also youngest partner in the room. What did you bring from there, and how has that helped you?
I think the biggest thing I bring to the table is empathy. I know how very, very hard it is to build a company. I know what the challenges are like, and I think it's really the empathy that actually inspired me to take on this role, because I've been through that as a founder, and it was investors, that one particular investor that really kicked us to get us to do sales, that has led to my learning and my growth. Sort of now is a chance to pay it back, to pay it forward, right? To really do that, especially a lot of the founders we invest in are actually also first-time founders. So really helping them to shortcut these learnings, shortcut these mistakes is something that I count it as a privilege to do as my day job.
There's just the thing about being a founder, right? That you have to have an eye on the macro and the micro all at once, and often, all as a novice, be it the technicalities, the registration, the regulatory part of it. Yeah. And also getting product market fit, strategy, hiring all done at once.
It's a lot, but what I always tell founders, sales solves problems, right? If you have sales, if you have demand, everything else can be solved. And I think that's actually one of the biggest, I would say, cautions and red flags I try to wave out, especially in sort of this ecosystem. People love to obsess about products and technology. And don't get me wrong, products and technology are important. But in my mind, those are just table stakes, right? You just need that to enter the game. After that, what you really need is to think about distribution, to think about go-to-market, to think about selling, right? And I think that's the same whether you are a founder, but even if you are a young working professional, it's the same. So what if you really know you're the domain expert, you know how to solve all these problems, but no one else knows about it? Then it's kind of pointless, right? And that's how you get passed over. That's how you get looked over for things like promotions and opportunities. So really, I think it's important to think about how do you put yourself out there? How do you sell? How do you distribute? How do you help people to understand what you can do, right? I think definitely our Asian heritage just gives us a bit of reluctance to do that, as people always say, a bit paiseh, a bit embarrassing to do that. But once again, I think that's just usually an excuse for fear of failure, fear of rejection. And I know that because I went through that. And let's be honest, right? Even these days when I need to get into a selling mode, I'm also afraid of getting rejected, but it's just really about pushing through that feeling, right? So I think that's something that regardless, whether you're a founder, whether you are working for someone, I think that's just something to get past, right? To not let excuses hold back and not let fear of rejection get the better of you.
Perhaps then, could we talk about inspiring confidence from a more inward perspective, right?
Yeah.
How did you inspire confidence with the teammates you brought on board for that venture at Glints, as well as right now in Saison, with the ventures you all bring on board? How do you inspire that confidence with your peers, with the ventures you worked with the teammates you had?
I think it's important to also understand what's the why and what's the vision, right? I think at Glints, it was very clear because of the impact that we were making to individuals. Every now and then, we would get stories from people who are our age or even maybe slightly older who say, hey, I took an internship, I took a job that I discovered through Glints. I never even knew that this existed. And because of that, I'm doing really well, right? We had situations where people found internships on our platform and they ended up not just being full-time employees, but even key leadership positions of that. And I think those stories really help us to remember the why of the business. It's not just, once again, about making money. Of course, that's important, but really about the impact that we get to create, right? So that was at Glints. Now, in my current role as an investor, I think that's also even more real, right? We have the opportunity to support founders, and these founders in turn create products, they create jobs that impact many. So I think it's really that ability to understand why we're doing what we're doing, and to also make that real, true stories, right? Because sometimes we don't want the why to just be like a mission statement that you put on the wall and you forget. It's really about understanding that the impact that you have created. Maybe I'll give a specific example in my current role. One of the investments we did is actually a poultry agri-tech startup in Indonesia. And because of, ever since we invested, which was about 18 months ago up to today, they have actually created more than 300 jobs in the rural parts across Indonesia, right? Because of their ability to grow. And I think that starts to become meaningful, right? You're talking about 300 individuals who can pretty much move up a whole social class as a result of the work that this company is doing. So it's just that sense of being clear on the impact, being clear on the why.
So, you spent a very compressed and intense period, right? You've done so much, just so much experience. Has there ever been the feeling that, I've peaked early and, you've crested it? Do you ever get a feeling? I
always feel like I'm not at the peak yet. I need to get there. A bit paranoid, definitely, but I think I think the sense of it is that there's still a lot more to be done. And I feel like time is running out. I'm already in my 30s, albeit early 30s, but I feel like there's a clock I'm running against. So,
clock you're running against for what? For, do you have certain goals? Or, it doesn't have to be really personal, but I guess in terms of impact, professionally speaking.
Yeah, I think definitely it's really about how many more people can I impact, can I share these learnings, especially mistakes, right? I think one thing that I am very cautious is everyone lives their own story, everyone lives their own experience, but I think there's a lot of, once again, lessons, a lot of mistakes I made that hopefully I can shortcut. That's one. And also secondly, I think recognizing that I've been, to be honest, very fortunate along the way. People always say, is it ability? I think ability is less than half of it. A lot of it was, to put it bluntly, a bit like luck, right? A bit like other people took a chance on me. For example, the way that Glints even started was because a friend of a friend, we met for the first time. This was in 2013. Met us for the first time and said, hey, would you want $50,000 as the first angel investment? And you can imagine at that point, $50,000 was more money than what us 19 years old have ever seen, right? So it's like, should that interaction had not happened, I'm pretty sure Glints would not have existed today. And of course, there's just so many of these other stories. So I think really for me, what drives me is really how much can I create luck for others? Can I help create opportunities that help people to rise up? Because I feel like whatever I've done, even though I don't think it's that great, but I recognize that a lot of the good things that have happened to me is because other people took a chance and because I got lucky. So I think, how do I then create luck for others?
So this has been an interesting conversation in that it touches both a very practical part of it and there's also kind of a very philosophical part about, the nature of learning, how you can shortcut learning.
Yeah.
Do you see a place for like the more historical, kind of conventional, linear way of learning and gaining experience? Do you see that as being replaceable, or do you see that as being very complementary to this sort of shortcut approach?
Yeah, I think it really depends. People always ask me, hey, you dropped out, right? So should dropping out be the future? I always tell them, do you really want your doctor to have dropped out of medical school before they operate on you? The answer is no, right? So I think it's really dependent. Here's the thing, right? At the end of the day, it's about being clear about what is the fastest way to learn about it, right? For example, you want to learn about marketing, like there's no excuse, right? Take $50, go out, run a Google AdWords campaign for whatever, right? It's today, there's so many tools, there's so many things out there to just make all of this learning, all this experimentation so easy. So what I always say is, look, you can spend months and months on courses, on books, on how to do digital marketing, for example. Or you could take $50 or $100 of your own money, try to sell something which might not even exist, but just for the fun of it, right? Just to see how many people, let's say, put their email or try to purchase your product. And I think that would teach you so much more than any of these courses, these classes, right? So I think the ability to find out what is the real way of learning it and the real way of facing failure, of making mistakes, I think that's just the best way to learn.
So the point about learning and, in your current role dealing with founders, what do you think is the biggest gap that younger founders that you have experienced having to bridge compared to, let's say, those that are a bit further along that perhaps are now building ventures with an established career of several years under their belt?
Look, I think the biggest difference, it's, I've already belabored the point, so I will not belabor, but once again, the ability to sell and the willingness to sell, that's one. The second one that actually it's quite different, it really comes down to hiring, right? Often what we see is that, especially for the younger founders, they can be afraid of hiring people, exactly as you mentioned, who are more senior, more experienced, more tenure. And I think the biggest concern is the potential disagreements that come around. Basically, you end up surrounding yourself with yes men. I think that's the biggest danger that these young founders tend to experience. So really, we see it as our role to sort of call that out, to also guide founders along, to always remind them that, look, this is your company, right? Nothing is going to change that. You are always going to be the co-founder. Your shareholdings also reflect that, but it's important that you're able to sort of put aside that ego and recognize that, look, maybe you're not the right person to lead sales. You're not the right person to lead marketing. We need to get someone who's more experienced, who knows what needs to be done. So I think really around hiring and team building, that's something that I would say there's a difference when it comes towards age and maturity.
So on the team building point, how can someone develop their sort of, capability or capacity for team building quickly?
I think there's really no better way than to just firstly do it, but also to get mentorship and get guidance, right? That's something that it's really sort of important for founders to seek out, or in fact anyone for that matter, right? Yes. Whether they're a founder or not, to seek out mentors or people who can call them out, because often we ourselves live in an echo chamber where we start to believe, we start to tell ourselves certain stories. Sometimes all it takes is for a voice to sort of ask a question or call out something out, and that sometimes could be just a wake-up call. So I think surrounding yourself, building almost what we call like your board of advisors, just like how companies have board of directors, right? Who are your personal board of directors? I think that becomes important. And look, these board of directors don't need to necessarily be like super successful people, right? They just need to be counselors that you trust, and most importantly, you can truly open yourself up to. So even till today, I'm fortunate to have a group of friends that, as and when I face certain situations, I can totally be open to them about it, just to hear their thoughts. And sometimes I don't agree with the advice, but at least it's fine. They act as sort of that sounding board.
Yes, and I think that's particularly important, right, when you're thrust into that, to have the influence on building that, but none of that sort of prior structure and kind of incremental process. And of course, Qin En, your last piece of advice applies not just to young leaders or bosses, or really anyone, any young worker who's aspiring to better themselves. And on this note, I think it's great for us to just end off our show. Thanks, Qin En, for sharing your insights and personal experience.
Thank you, homie.
And I'm Tay Hong Yi, and if you have further questions on being a young boss or a young leader, or wish to share your own experience being either of these, do drop me an email. If you'd like to read my articles and the Headstart newsletter, or find me on LinkedIn, all these links are in our podcast show notes. This podcast episode is edited by Amiru Karim. Thanks for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening. Do note, all analyses, opinions, recommendations, and other information in this podcast are for general information purposes only and are not intended to be relied upon as financial advice. You should not rely on them in making any decision. Please consult a fully qualified financial advisor or professional expert for independent advice and verification. To the fullest extent permitted by law, SPH Media shall not be liable for any loss arising from the use of or reliance on any analyses, opinions, recommendations, and other information in this podcast. SPH Media accepts no responsibility or liability whatsoever that may result or arise from the products, services, or information of any third parties. All opinions expressed by participants in this podcast are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of SPH Media.